Thank you, everybody, for logging on today and checking out this presentation on the evolution of the insurance purchase channel with the particular focus on life stages. Just to give you a little background on this presentation, this data set was proprietary data that we had pulled together and done a presentation on the home and auto portion of this data at the Society for Insurance Research Conference in Orlando that we also did in a webinar this past fall. So this presentation will focus on the health portion of it, which I'm sure all of you are have a focus on health. But there will be a good deal of overlap in terms of the non-health specific questions. So just to kind of level set there as we get in at the outset here. So kind of what we've heard from our clients and partners is, and just from our own experience and our research, that the insurance world is changing, that the channel is definitely changing, and in terms of health specifically, healthcare reform has had a big impact on the industry, as we all know, and the dust really hasn't fully settled yet. So the impact of channel is still kind of the final impact on channel is kind of will remain to be seen fully. We did do a webinar about this time last year on kind of healthcare reform, so I won't get too deeply into that. I'll try to just focus on kind of the impact on channel when I'm speaking to it here. But I think it's definitely worth noting that some of the new changes and requirements would definitely have an impact on kind of a newly expanded market. So the individual market has definitely expanded as a result of it. There are folks who previously didn't have insurance and weren't required to have it that are now looking out to get it. So obviously that has an impact on the public exchange, but also has an impact on direct purchases, either through a carrier's website or over the phone. So that's something to kind of keep in mind. Also has an impact on opportunities for emerging channels. So that's something that we'll focus on, and you'll see kind of throughout this presentation. Things like online non-insurance retailers, retail stores, and that sort of thing. So kind of with all of this in mind, it was kind of our motivations for conducting this proprietary research and really kind of exploring the changing landscape that we have for the purchase channel. So just a little bit about what we did and how we did it. We conducted 500 online quant interviews with U.S. consumers. The age range was 25 to 64. And then we balanced the sample by census information for age, gender, and income. And there are many breaks. It's a pretty robust data set. But what we'll be focusing on here and in this presentation is generational breaks. And you can see Millennials, Gen Xers, and Boomers, and kind of how those are each broken out here. So as a requirement for taking this study, they had to have at least one of these lines of business for insurance: health, life, auto, or home. And for this report, 428 at the time of the interview had health insurance. We also conducted a handful of in-depth interviews with brokers just to kind of get the other side of the tale from them, kind of see what they're thinking about in terms of channel and how that's impacting them and their relationship with their client. And before we really get into the meat of it here, I just wanted to give a shout out and thank you to our partners. Taluna helped us with online hosting and also provided sample for the consumer piece. Vox Schlesinger and Associates helped with the sample and recruitment for the agent qual. And VoxPopMe is kind of a new methodology that we tested out for the first time for this, to kind of interject a little bit of customer experience and kind of a qual feel to the quant piece. And I'll speak to that a little bit later as we get into that portion of the presentation. So just to kind of give some context here on how we defined these various channels. The employer channel was for respondents through either their spouses or their parents' employer, but specifically not through an exchange. Direct, which will report through this presentation as a net, and that will be a net of two things that were asked separately, either over the phone or through a company's website, through the public exchange, and we definitely call that healthcare.gov in the questionnaire itself, or through a private exchange, and we define the private exchange as being set up through an insurance company or third-party company that could be sold either on its own or through an employer, through online retailers, and we define that as being a non-insurance company website, so it could be an aggregator like Google Compare, Overstock.com, or something like that, through a retail store, and that could be Walmart, Costco, CVS, etc., or through a broker. So as we start out here, we're just going to look at some of the data for current channel usage, if they've ever purchased, familiarity with the channels, and future consideration. So again, we have a focus on health here. This is asked if they've ever purchased, so we did not restrict this question to the last purchase that they made, so this is at any point. And we're taking a look here at just the overall numbers. We'll take a look at the generational breaks in a moment here, but if we look, probably not surprising for the industry that employer is the dominant purchase channel here, followed immediately by, or I guess distantly, by direct and the public exchange, both at 18% each. Then broker and other mentions, which include the highest mention in there is 3%, and that's private exchange, and all of the other mentions in there are 1% or less. So if we take a look at the generational gaps here, you'll kind of see this theme pervading throughout this presentation, that the green is millennial, the orange is Gen Xers, and the boomers are blue. You can see that the first thing that pops here is employer for Gen Xers, and we thought this was interesting and had speculated a bit on this. It seems like part of it is the fact that boomers are more likely to use brokers, and Gen Xers are just in general somewhat less likely to use direct or the public exchange in comparison to the other two, but we thought this was a relatively interesting data point. Also on this slide, we can see that direct is definitely popping for millennials. They are more likely to be using this channel. And as we mentioned, the Gen Xers and definitely to more extent the boomers are more likely to be using the broker channel in comparison to millennials, who just aren't using it that much. Boomers are twice as likely as are millennials to use that channel. So what we have here is familiarity with these new emerging channels. So we have a 3-point scale, and this is top 2 box, either familiar or have ever heard of it. So the channels we looked at as the emerging channels and identified for this presentation were the public exchange, even though that's relatively wide known, the private exchange, online retailers, and the retail store. And again, if we look at the overall numbers here, public exchange, as we mentioned, is pretty pervasive, at least at this point. It's been around for long enough and been kind of in the forefront that folks are aware of it. Private exchanges as well have a pretty good visibility. Online retailers have about 4 in 10 have at least heard of it and heard of that as a channel for purchasing insurance, and retail store is about the same, slightly less. Now, if we look at this by the generational gap, public exchange is kind of even set in terms of those who say they're familiar. Millennials are slightly less likely in comparison to Gen X and boomers. If we look at the private exchange, millennials start to pop here. You see a little bit more in terms of familiarity, close with Gen Xers, definitely more so than boomers, and then top 2 box a little bit higher than both. And then online retailers, they are definitely the dominant force here, both in familiarity and having any heard of it all in comparison to the other 2 groups here. And then kind of a relatively even mix in comparison with retail store. Gen Xers are a little bit less so here. Definitely more familiarity, top box with millennials, but it kind of evens out there, and we kind of attribute that to the fact that everybody kind of has an experience, some connection to retail stores, so that's not something that's completely out of what our expectations would be. So if you look at consideration, and this is on top 2 box on a 7-point scale for consideration here, we can see that more than a quarter would be likely to consider a public exchange at some point in the future for a health insurance purchase. In terms of the rest of these numbers and all of them, we kind of leave it up to you to decide if that's high or not, but we're kind of looking this as a comparison to one another, and then you look at it on the generational gap. So 1 in 10 are looking at online retailer and retail store, and private exchange is somewhere in the middle there at about 2 in 10. But the story really starts to emerge, and the rubber hits the road with the generational gap when we look at that for consideration. So you can see that millennials are definitely more likely than the other two, especially boomers, to consider these emerging channels for purchase. Definitely private exchange is a big pop for them in comparison to boomers. Looks like Gen Xers are relatively close to them there. Online, they're twice as likely as Gen Xers and almost 4 times as likely as boomers to choose that, and the same with retail store. So another point that we looked at was Amazon.com. Now, we understand that they're not currently offering insurance, but we've seen that idea thrown around a bit, so we thought it would be interesting just to kind of throw it out in this study and ask about consideration. If Amazon were to offer health insurance, what would your likelihood be to consider that for an insurance purchase in the future? And we've left online retailer here just for a note of comparison here for the brand of Amazon. You can see that it's dead even. 11% would consider for each, and similar to what we saw on the last page, definitely younger folks are more likely to consider Amazon in comparison to especially boomers. So we decided to dive a little bit deeper into 2 of these emerging channels based on kind of our internal conversations and some of the things that we've heard from our clients and our partners. The 2 being online aggregators and online retailers and retail stores. And how we did this, at least what we'll be seeing next, I had mentioned we use that partner VoxPopMe. And what we're going to see in a moment are videos that have been captured through the online quant piece. So these folks had an option of either uploading a video themselves or typing in text. And this is the first time that we actually used this methodology in any of our studies. And we didn't really know what to expect, to be honest. We went into it kind of thinking that we didn't know what kind of response rate would we get, would anybody actually do this? And then again, if they did, what would the quality be? And we went through and we were actually very pleasantly surprised with the level of engagement that we had, the richness of the responses that we got, and kind of the diversity of responses that we received. We thought that it would probably be almost exclusively the younger folks who would go ahead and choose this. And while they did, we did have more of them, there was a great amount of diversity in terms of the different age groups that we had there. So just to kind of level set on how we presented this idea to them when we asked this initial open-ended question, we presented this as a newer way of purchasing insurance. And for this next question, we were looking to get their general thoughts and feelings on each of these. So we'll go into online retailers or aggregators first. So I'm going to play a few of these for you. Hopefully I'm going through my computer speakers here. You can hear them loud and clear.
I think this would be a great deal for people who are looking to buy insurance and to be a competitive environment to help get the prices down and bring more people in.
As far as non-insurance company websites are concerned, I would be interested if the price was right to go through a website for maybe auto insurance, as long as there was somebody on the other end that I could speak to directly, whether it's via Skype or an online chat. I just wouldn't want written information being sent over a non-secure email with my pricing and my, if it was health insurance information or vehicle insurance, home insurance It would have to be some kind of a secure email.
Final.
Insurance from non-insurance websites. Again, I don't know about the quality of the insurance and whether there is expertise to sell insurance, and if I have questions, who's going to answer it for me? So I do have some reservations about that. And besides, do I trust these websites to keep my information secure?
Okay. So we saw there that the first gentleman here had some was pretty open to the idea. He thought that it would bring competition to the market, and that could potentially translate into to better pricing. The second recording that we saw there, she was definitely open to the idea, especially if it had provided a better price, but definitely wanted there to have some sort of inclusion of a resource for expertise. And she also had some security concerns in terms of transferring any personal information over line and how that all worked. The third gentleman was more skeptical. He had concerns about the quality of the actual product, as well as the expertise of any support staff. So what we did here is we have kind of all of the unaided responses here. So this is both the video and text responses to this open-end on general reactions. And we can see here that definitely a lot more folks had responded negatively as a general reaction to this than had responded either positively or neutrally. But when we went ahead and drilled down in additional open-ends for benefits, they were able to identify some relatively clearly. A quarter had said that saving money or getting better rates was an advantage of these online aggregators, as well as having convenience and being able to do it on your own and saving time by kind of making all these comparisons at once. And kind of going along with that is actually being able to make those comparisons and have those rates side by side. So that kind of plays into both of those. Also, when we asked for drawbacks, it was pretty clear that some definitely were issues that we had seen in some of those videos that we just listened to. Trust, safety, security were big ones. The actual support staff or not having folks like a broker or somebody who's an expert to really deal with and help guide was an issue. And also basically just not being able to access any customer support staff. So kind of a fear of if there was anyone actually there that they could reach if they had questions. So we had 80 perceptions. Again, this is a top 2 box on a 7-point scale here for agreement. When we asked for benefits, we can see that there is definitely that generational gap comes in, that millennials and Gen Xers, in comparison to boomers, are more likely to see the advantages of online retailers in comparison. So some of those things that we saw before, being able to quote multiple carriers at once, convenience, ease of purchasing, getting the best price, and being able to do it yourself are definitely things that are more important to the younger generation. And conversely, when we look at drawbacks, we have the opposite happening. So not having broker expertise and having that person is definitely an issue for a lot of folks. I mean, you can even see that some of these are issues for half of them anyway, but just in the comparison between millennials and Gen Xers and that 73% for boomers, it's a pretty big gap, as well as no live person to talk to. And interestingly enough, kind of the flip side of what we saw above, that being able to get the best price is much more of an issue for boomers. It looks like the exact opposite of the chart that we saw above. So it seems like there's definitely some generational correlations there. So the next emerging channel that we dove a little bit more deeply into was retail stores. So the way that we positioned this was that it was in-person retailers like Costco, Walmart, and CVS are offering different types of insurance to be purchased in their stores, either in-store by calling or on their website. So again, we asked the same series of questions for retail stores as a channel for purchasing insurance. So we'll go through a few recordings here so you get a little bit of flavor for how the respondents felt about this in general.
Retailers like Walmart, CVS, Costco, companies like that that are physical building in your hometown, that you can go and you can actually do insurance shopping while you're doing your other shopping. And it's a very good idea.
I don't feel that a non-insurance retail store has the proper expertise to give you advice on purchasing any type of insurance. I would not trust anything that they have to say.
Third?
My opinion on whether or not I would buy something from a Walmart like insurance, yeah, I wouldn't. One, they're not specialized or have the knowledge to do that. That would be like me going in there to buy milk. You know, I'm not going to ask what someone else's opinion is unless you're a specialist. And there's no way someone at Walmart is a specialist. I don't buy my phones there. I'm certainly not going to buy insurance there. Okay, so what we saw there was a good mix. The first gentleman had spoke to kind of one-stop shopping and the convenience of it to be able to go somewhere that he's going to go anyway and not have to make a special trip was an advantage for him. The second woman had cited the lack of expertise or knowledge of staff, not really wanting to purchase from someone who is not an expert. And just as a caveat to how we had set this up, we did not specify if there would be any experts there, or maybe a broker that was set up, or a representative who had more expertise. We kind of just left it as that open point that I had mentioned earlier. So perhaps that's something for some of these folks that could allay some of those fears. And then the third one was interesting. She mentioned not wanting to buy milk or phones from Walmart. We know a lot of folks do that. So that was interesting to see and what we have there. But there's definitely, you can see there's some trust issues with purchasing this kind of a product from a retail store. So again, going into the unaided perceptions about a retail store in general, you can see that this is a very similar scale that we have here, that 60% find it negative compared to 23 and 19%. This does not add to 100%. We had some that were other responses. We had benefits. Similarly, we were able to identify some one-stop shopping, as we saw with that first recording. Was the highest pop, so 31%, being able to kind of go about your daily business and not have to make other trips. Being able to save money and better rates, that could be associations with the actual retail store, or just the channel itself. And then drawbacks, as we saw, the lack of expertise and trust issues were the biggest pop, as well as not having a broker to be able to answer questions or not being able to find any decent customer support staff. So as we looked and asked about aided benefits and drawbacks, we see a little bit of a similar generational gap, but it's leveled out a bit in terms of retail stores. And again, we kind of attribute that to the younger folks are probably more comfortable with online, whereas everybody really has an experience with retail stores. But there is still some generational gap with a few of these in terms of best price and doing it yourself, that those are definitely more prominent benefits for millennials and Gen Xers in comparison to baby boomers. And conversely, we see a couple of these points pop for boomers, that expertise is definitely more important to them, and being afraid of not having that, as well as the flip side of that best price that wouldn't be coming from this channel. So at another point, what we decided we wanted to do is really just understand what's important to consumers when they're going ahead and actually trying to purchase an insurance product and choosing which one to actually purchase. So what are the things that are driving these purchase decisions and behaviors? So
what we did here was identified 4 factors that are kind of all arms of a scale, and we gave respondents 100 points to a lot and kind of put in these buckets as they felt was most appropriate and really what was most important to them. So they were able to allot these 100 points as they saw fit. There were a few generational gaps, which are not charted here. Boomers, not surprisingly with what we saw just a moment ago, felt like working with an expert was more important in comparison to the younger groups. So that's 31% versus 23% for Gen Xers and 21% for Millennials, whereas the younger groups, especially Millennials, felt that being able to have the independence and do it themselves was more important in comparison to the other groups. So they were 17%, then kind of going down that scale, 14% for Gen Xers and 10% for Boomers. But really what the big story here is that price is key, 43%, which is much higher than any of the other buckets here with the big pop, and that was universal among subgroups here. So that really is a big driving factor and probably not big news to anyone who's had any connection to the industry. But then thinking about that, if we go back, bring it back to channels, what actually provides that best price? And kind of thinking about what we looked at with some of those earlier, this probably shouldn't be too shocking that Boomers are much more likely to feel that a broker or agent would provide them with the best price, whereas the younger generations are much more even across, that online retailers really is on par, especially for Millennials, with being able to get the best price for them. So price being the real driver here for purchase, really focusing in on those channels and which one will provide the best price are interesting to look at here. So then what we did as part of this research, we wanted to get the flip side of that coin. So in the actual quantitative piece, what we did was we looked at some of the consumers' views of their broker and agent relationship when they actually decided to work with them among those who did. So we wanted to kind of get that idea and see, how that relationship is viewed. We'll definitely be dealing with this in much more detail in a future webinar that I believe will be coming out in a few months or a little bit later on this year. But we just wanted to take a look at this at kind of a high level to give you a little bit of context for how this all worked. So we had a hypothesis here just in terms of kind of what was valued, especially by the younger group of folks. Was it that do-it-yourself and just kind of, okay, leave me to my thing, let me do what I want to do without any problems and take care of it and have that independence? Or is it working with someone and actually having that expertise? And our hypothesis was that we would probably see something that we saw similar to what we saw in the previous slides, that if we actually pitted the two against each other, that being able to do it yourself was going to be more important to the Millennials than it would to actually have that guidance and expertise. And what actually happened was we were wrong. That's why you do the research, and it's a really interesting finding, the fact that more than twice as much Millennials felt that expertise and guidance was more important than actually being able to do it yourself. And just a note that there was a neutral point on the scale, so this does not add up to 100%. So we kind of attribute that to the fact that they're still relatively new to the market. They don't really know what they need to know. They're not experts, most of them, on the vast majority on kind of what the different facets of policies are. So being able to have that resource for guidance was definitely important to them. However, when we look at this by the other generational gaps, we can see that the scale is definitely tipped in the opposite direction. So whereas, yes, it's definitely a lot more important it's twice as important to Millennials, that scale shifts significantly as you go into X's and certainly Boomers. They feel expertise is far more important. So again, we saw this early on, but just for folks who have actually purchased through a broker or agent, we can see that brokers are twice as likely as millennials to have done so. So it is definitely a channel that they are using more frequently. And when asked among those who actually worked with a broker, what were some of the things, what were the reasons why they actually chose to do so? Not surprisingly, expertise and knowledge was a top punch, as well as being able to discuss my needs, so having that personal relationship there. And also a handful of mentions on being like friend or family, really going deeper into that relationship, going beyond kind of the interaction, the professional interaction, and kind of knowing their life and being able to be a part of that. So what we did as another part of this, we had an exercise here, and we showed them something called a blob tree. And this is a projective technique typically used in qualitative research that we added into the quantitative online piece. It was developed in the UK, and it's used to help respondents kind of express and project how they feel about a given relationship. And it could be with a brand or whatever kind of relationship they want to think about. We were thinking about their relationship with their agent. So we asked them to go ahead and choose which image best represented their relationship, and then we asked them why. But these were the 4 images that popped most often for our respondents. And it's basically when we asked them why and what about these images really represented their relationship, being helpful and supportive, having a partner or family friend kind of talking about that deep relationship that goes beyond the professional, being there when they were needed, really having that resource and that kind of that safety net, and just being overall happy and satisfied with that. So kind of the flip side of the coin, I had mentioned earlier when I talked about the setup of the study, we wanted to take a look at the things from the agent perspective. So we did a handful of in-depth telephone interviews with agents, and really just wanted to see how they feel about these emerging channels and kind of what impact this is having on them, or they see having on their business in the future. So when we look at this first, they recognize that the channels are changing and these new emerging channels are out there. So they understand that people go online and they have a tendency, especially younger folks, to kind of do this themselves and do it on their own as sites have become better and people are more familiar with the internet and using it for different purchases and things like that. The idea of getting multiple quotes, being able to compare, was definitely something that they recognized as an advantage or a reason why folks might look to these emerging channels. Being able to purchase online or over the phone and the convenience of that, being able to do it quickly and not really having to dive too deeply into it. There was a flip side of that, the fact that there's not as much that can be done and you don't really get into that relationship as deeply, which we'll see in a moment. And then also that they recognize that retail locations are something that are coming up, and similar to what we saw in some of those videos, being able to have somebody there who is knowledgeable, they feel is of paramount importance for that to work at all. But when asked if it's really going to have any impact on their long-term business, they didn't really think so. So they really had a big focus on that relationship and building that relationship, kind of going back to what we saw on the blob tree, that friends and family, the feel of going beyond that professional interaction is something that's really important. Kind of having less technology, and technology isn't really best suited to have somebody help you find what's best for you. Really, you need to have that personal relationship to really be able to get down to that by talking to someone directly and having that relationship and that dialogue with an expert. And honestly, they all of them felt as though, yeah, this is something that's out there, but ultimately our business is with the folks who need that personal relationship and want to have that personal relationship. So we don't see this having a long-term effect on our business and what we do and who we target. So that is our presentation and the data that we have. I am certainly open to additional questions now, or if you want to reach out to me later and you think about this, information will be available to you. You are more than welcome to reach out to me at any point with any questions or to learn more about this data.
Thanks, Andy. This is Brad. We do have a couple quick questions here, and I'll see if any other additional questions come in. The first is, what was the generational breakout of those who decided to use the videos?
Okay. Yeah, we had kind of spoken to that a little bit early on. We thought that it was going to be completely one-sided in terms of millennials, and it was. There definitely were more, which is not completely surprising, who used that Vox Pop Me app and actually used the videos. We had, I think, 60% who had used that were millennials, but then we had a pretty even split of baby boomers and Gen X at 20% each. So not a surprising result in the fact that there were more millennials, but the fact that so many, especially without additional incentive, the older folks were completely comfortable and had used it as well. So it was definitely a really interesting, cool new methodological tool that we hadn't used before that we were pleasantly surprised about and have been using it in our research practices since.
Okay, great, thank you. One more question. Are there additional demographic cuts of the data besides generation?
Yes. So as I mentioned early on in the presentation, we have an extremely rich data set. There is a lot more to this. It's very robust. So we have a lot of the traditional breaks. So we have things like age, cuts by gender. Age obviously is what we did here. We have cuts by gender, household income, race, marital status, children in household, among other things. So there are a lot of different ways that we can cut this. So we can definitely run custom cuts if you're interested in looking at anything in more depth. We're happy to dive into that with you. So again, if there's anyone who would like to kind of know what we have in this data set and would like to take a look at the survey itself to see what questions we asked, I'm happy to share that. So please don't hesitate to reach out to me.